This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. You can always find us at WNPR.org/The Wheelhouse and join our conversation on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. As a matter of fact, we're on Facebook Live today, so you can watch our program as well. Our guests, as always, include Colin McEnroe. He's the host of The Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Howdy, Colin.
Good morning, Mr. Dankosky.
Emily Munson is here. She's state capitol reporter for Hearst, Connecticut Media. Hello there, Emily.
Hello.
And Dr. Jonathan Wharton. He's associate professor of political science and urban affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. Hello there, Jonathan.
Good morning.
Well, we like to have some fun with the news every week when we can. Some weeks it's harder to have fun than others, and this is one of those weeks. With back-to-back mass shootings this weekend in El Paso and Dayton, Congress is once again under pressure to meaningfully address the issue of gun violence. At the state capitol on Monday, Senator Richard Blumenthal told gun safety advocates that this may actually be the best chance in the last decade of passing gun safety measures in Washington. Here's a clip from his speech.
This ought to be bipartisan. There is no excuse for anyone, regardless of party, geography, to do anything but lead at this point. Mitch McConnell, it's up to you. You can call us back, or you can evade your responsibility. You can do your job so we can do our job. We should be back in Washington right now doing our job and passing gun violence prevention laws that will make America safer.
So McConnell, of course, is the Senate Majority Leader. He's recovering this week from a fractured shoulder. He has not ended the summer recess as of yet. It seems unlikely that he will. Elsewhere, though, amongst the GOP, there's indications that the mass shootings may spur some legislation. Blumenthal himself is teaming with South Carolina Republican Lindsey Graham on a bill encouraging states to pass so-called red flag laws. Red flag laws, Colin, is something that President Trump talked about in his speech. There are some other things that he tweeted about this week that he did not talk about in his speech. He'll be spending today in these two places, in Dayton and El Paso. I guess, first of all, I'll ask you, what do you make of the chances of anything changing in Congress around gun legislation?
I think if anything happens, well, first of all, I mean, the red flag law, the fact that Graham is a co-sponsor of it, and we should say the red flag law basically is kind of a temporary relief provision for situations in which police and families agree that there's somebody in the house who is unstable. I may be doing a poor job of summarizing it. I should also say, you know, that's going to address – it might be worth talking about. It is worth talking about, but it's going to address a very small percentage of these situations. And one of the things that happens with this debate is when people don't want to talk about guns, they talk about mental illness. Studies indicate that if you could eliminate by magic wand, which was the only way you could do it, the role of all mental illness and violent crime in America, you would reduce violent crime by 4%. And obviously, you're not going to eliminate the role of mental illness. Often people who are mentally ill and are going to commit crimes are harder to identify than that. But even if you could, it doesn't really make that big a dent. I would say, you know, the problem, as John Paul Stevens would have told you, is the U.S. Constitution, which is an overrated document that's only been amended 27 times. And there's two constitutional problems here. One of them is the Second Amendment, but even more importantly here is the Constitution of Congress. The House of Representatives, which is a much more sensitive instrument, you know, if they notice that there's big support in suburban America and they're kind of electorally worried about that kind of stuff, and they're much more sensitive to the concerns of small groups of constituents, you get two U.S. senators no matter whether you're Wyoming or California. And so rural areas which tend to oppose gun control are overrepresented in the U.S. Senate. It makes it very hard to pass meaningful gun control. Now, having said all that, there might be kind of meaningful-ish, you know, background check kind of things that maybe just given the heat of this moment you might be able to do, but I don't rate the possibility of true reform all that high.
But again, the president has spoken, at least on Twitter in the past, about universal background checks, something that could happen at the federal level. Most polls suggest very, very strong support for universal background checks, and that's important in cases like what happened in Gilroy, California, where a gun is purchased elsewhere in another state. That's very important here in the Northeast, Colin, where Many of our states have very strong gun control laws, but other states that are nearby, like, say, Virginia, don't have strong gun control laws. You can buy a gun there and you can bring it up to Connecticut or Massachusetts. Maybe red flag laws, which started here in Connecticut back in 1999, maybe something like universal background checks have a chance this time. But it's like we've said this before, right? We started saying this in 2012 around Sandy Hook.
Right. So, for example, I believe the gun in Gilroy was bought in Nevada. I mean, if you don't have federal policy, you've got a hole in the bucket at all times. Universal background checks poll really well. It's worth noting that any specific measure polls way better. If you ask a polled person, a poll respondee, do you favor increased gun control? That doesn't poll that well. If you poll on specific stuff, particularly universal background checks, that ought to be an easy one to do. But just starting with the president, before he gave his Monday speech, he tweeted that he would maybe want to talk about meaningful gun control, universal, some kind of background check increase. Although in a weird way, he tied it to immigration policy, which seemed like he was already trying to craft some kind of bargain. Like, we could do this if I get my immigration policy. But by the time he gave his scripted speech, that whole idea was nowhere to be heard.
So, Emily, what do you make of this? You obviously are following state lawmakers. Overwhelmingly, the state is run by Democrats. Democrats overwhelmingly support gun control legislation. Connecticut has already passed some of the strongest gun control laws in the entire nation. So what do we make of a Richard Blumenthal sitting down across the table from Lindsey Graham, someone who used to be seen as a moderate in Congress and now has increasingly been in the president's camp, now maybe coming back to the table and taking a moderating position on something like a red flag law?
Connecticut lawmakers want to see federal reforms on this issue. As Colin pointed out, state laws are only as strong as their neighbors' laws because guns can travel freely over state lines. And while Connecticut does have many strong gun laws, including requiring background checks for the transfer of guns, requiring licenses, and many other provisions, including safe storage of guns, which was passed this year, those laws are sometimes ineffective if someone can go purchase a gun in another state without such precautions and bring it here. So I think some Connecticut lawmakers feel frustrated because they feel like they have taken many steps to try to address this issue here in Connecticut, but they feel limited. And we saw that that sentiment from the House Majority Leader Matt Ritter this week, who said he wants 34 state legislatures to vote on a constitutional convention to change the U.S. Constitution to ban assault-style firearms. Now, the likelihood that we're going to have a constitutional convention on gun reform seems quite unlikely, but this idea shows state lawmakers' frustration with Congress that they seem unable to pass reforms on the topic of guns.
What's interesting, though, Emily, is in that particular instance, Ritter is taking on a very specific type of weapon, as we've seen in the past with bans in various states, including Connecticut. Gun makers tend to be one step ahead of whatever laws are passed in terms of the type of weaponry. And there's a big argument about whether or not it's actually effective to ban assault-style weapons, whether or not that only takes care of a small portion of the overall gun violence in America. I mean, the big numbers, the tens of thousands of people who are shot largely with handguns. An awful lot of them are suicides. Many of them are domestic violence incidents. Is that an instance maybe of taking up one piece of the issue that's not particularly as germane as something like a red flag law or a universal background check, which could be used in a case like these most recent mass shootings potentially, but also could be more widely applicable across all of the gun violence we see?
Yeah, I think state lawmakers want to see all of these things done. They are concerned about assault-style firearms or firearms that are more automatic because of the potential for very rapid destruction. And we've seen those in mass shootings around the country. However, they certainly support federal passage of red flag laws, which we have here in Connecticut, and universal background checks to mirror some of the background check legislation we have here in the state.
State officials are also making sure to criticize the president and others within the president's party about some of the rhetoric around guns, gun safety, and also white nationalism, also around hate and violence. Here's Lieutenant Governor Susan Bysowitz extending some of her criticism against President Trump.
Stopping hate takes leadership from the highest levels of our national government and our state government. And let me say that the silence on the other side is deafening. We have invited leaders in our state from both sides of the aisle. So take a look and take note who is here and who is not.
So, Jonathan, I'll turn to you. You're active in Republican Party politics. There's really a couple things happening here. One has to do with guns and gun legislation. Mm-hmm. And as we've seen with Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal, there's a chance maybe of some reconciliation. We're seeing some Ohio lawmakers at the state level crossing over party lines and saying we need to do something about gun control legislation. Then there's the issue of what is motivating some of these most recent attacks. In the case of Gilroy, in the case of El Paso, very clearly, there is something about hate and white nationalism that is at the forefront of this. There's a very clear racist attack against Hispanics in El Paso, targeting Mexicans and Mexican Americans who are shopping in the city that really crosses over the border. How do you think the party, the Republican Party, is dealing with this? And do you think that there is some change coming to some minds, whether it's Republicans at the state level or at the federal level?
Well, first off, rhetoric is obviously an issue, but it's not the entire issue. How things are framed and how they're said, not just by the president, but even by the party, is critical. And so messaging is important. I have emphasized this over and over again, certainly as a party official. It's no secret, but it is our era now that's in 2019. Polls matter, and there's some things that get stoke the fire and inflames many people to get involved and engaged the way sometimes too often they do. It's a matter of going too far with it. I also want to add that I think, unfortunately, the way Congress is operating today, I don't see anything getting done in the next couple months. This is at a very interesting time for Congress because it's in a recess period. So what could possibly be done? Very little. Emily does share, at least, and I share the concerns here, that sometimes it has to take place at the state level. If you look in the tri-state area, for example, New Jersey, where they do the smart guns legislation, that's a start, even though that's probably still not enough. I agree with Colin's point that really we're dealing with the Second Amendment. This is something that has to be addressed with the amendment itself. And so as much as Congress can try to take it, as much as the states will try to address it, this is something that's got to be taken head on in terms of resolving what's going on with the Second Amendment. Now, whether both parties will chime in on this or they politicize it, like we've seen in the last 24 hours, you've seen the tweets between Beto and certainly Trump. It's going to remain that way, unfortunately, in the public forum.
But for people who don't know about the smart gun legislation in New Jersey, explain it.
Oh, sure. Of course. It gives at least an indication of the gun owner being the one to fire the weapon. And what was required in New Jersey was that at least gun shops have to have at least one gun available. Many gun companies and gun owners saying that this is wrong. You're pigeonholing at least this requirement for gun shops to have this kind of requirement. But it is something that is a start towards something.
Yeah,
at the state level.
And it's something that an awful lot of gun manufacturers push back against very, very hard and
Absolutely.
have since the beginning. Colin?
Yeah, I would just say that it's important to kind of unyoke these two issues a little bit, particularly vis-a-vis the Republican Party. I think the Republican Party increasingly does have a problem in its inability to meaningfully address gun problems in America, and it is going to hurt it in the suburbs. There's an increasing amount of concern about that among suburban voters if they're not responsive. I think 9 Republican members of Congress have already announced they're not seeking re-election. It's a harder and harder thing to do.
I think it's 10, Colin. I think one more came through.
It's up to 10. Yeah. And on Sunday, the national shows kind of made a point of saying we can't get any Republican members of Congress to come on the show today. I think Yoho from Florida eventually showed up, but really, And it should tell you something. If you're a member of Congress and you're associated with a set of ideas that are so unpopular that in the teeth of a terrible tragedy, you can't go on TV, you have a problem. You probably shouldn't be associated with those ideas. So there's that. Then there's this whole question of hate and hateful rhetoric and stuff like that, which is a muddier, murkier issue. It certainly needs to be talked through and talked out. I think that they have a problem anytime they don't renounce, denounce, and repudiate that kind of stuff. But to me, those are kind of two separate issues for the party.
Two separate issues for the party, but I'll say, Colin, there's at least some indication that words matter in shootings that have happened over the course of the last couple decades. When we saw what happened with Gabby Giffords, when we've seen some of the manifestos that have come through from mass shooters citing previous mass shootings, and some of the rhetoric that has been spouted, whether it's out of the White House or in the mainstream conservative media, there's a sense that words actually matter. And I guess I'm wondering how we hold people accountable for those words, if there's any likelihood, any possibility that is what is motivating some people to go and do these things.
Right. So, first of all, hat tip to NPR's Franco Ordonez, who did this kind of playlist on either All Things Considered or Morning Edition, I no longer remember, of all of the things that Donald Trump has said. All of the things that Donald Trump has said from campaign through these first years of his administration that seem to be, and in some cases simply are, statements of aggressive tendencies towards non-white people. And when you listen to it all, it's kind of played out there before you, you realize, I mean, there's absolutely a pattern, and we need to speak out against it. The press needs to speak out against it. The Democrats need to speak out against it, which they do all the time. And I'm hoping over the next year or two to see more Republicans speak out against it. I mean, it's hard to do causative stuff. For example, the El Paso guy in his 8chan manifesto specifically said he had all these ideas before Trump. He realized that Trump would come up as an issue after he committed his massacre, and he wanted to make that point. Now, whether you can believe something somebody says in an 8chan manifesto, whether he had those ideas but felt further emboldened by them because the president of the United States seems to share at least some of those ideas. You know, it's kind of a harder thing to measure. But there's no question that there's been a kind of recrudescence of white supremacist rhetoric, and we can't pretend that it's just a rhetorical problem. Yeah, it does show up in the marketplace of action.
Emily?
Today, President Trump is visiting Ohio and Texas. I believe he'll be in Ohio this morning and Texas later today. And, you know, that has caused some controversy for some of the reasons that Colin just laid out. City officials and local officials there have been unsure if they want him to come. And there's activists with signs in the streets. You can find photos on the internet where they say, we're stressed, you know, leave us to mourn for a little bit because we do feel your rhetoric has been a part of this. But, you know, the president is in a position to enact change here. And we saw on Monday in his speech that, you know, when he supported the red flag law, I do think that gave more Republicans cover to move in this direction and support this legislation. And we're seeing the effects of that. We saw that Governor Mike DeWine, a Republican governor of Ohio, is now calling for a version of a red flag law in that state, as well as background checks and other gun control proposals after the shooting there. And many Republicans in Congress are coming out in favor of a red flag law. So in terms of what can get done, that seems most likely, although this is coming up at a time of recess, as Jonathan pointed out, which makes it tricky. Hopefully, you know, if something is to be done, we need to see kind of sustained pressure on this topic. And you know, something that could sink it is if Democrats do try to tie red flag laws to other kinds of gun reforms that they've pushed. They passed a House bill that included background check legislation, and if they tie those two issues together, or if immigration is lumped in, like President Trump brought up earlier, that could sink the chances of passage.
And let's face it, what's the earliest that they would come up with a plan? September, maybe? I'm being generous with that. I mean, I worked for Congress for years, for a half dozen years. They are very slow, and the rhetoric will only be turned up further. But I like, Emily, what you highlighted. The fact is the president's going to both locations. He has to. And as much as the mayors and the governors are saying one way or the other, they're against it, they're for it, this is pro forma. A president has to do this. Whether it's Trump, whether it's Obama, this is the moment, this is the time to do it this week. Whether you embrace it or not, that's another story. We elected a president. This is a civic responsibility of a public official. So to me, this is so minor, but it's symbolic and it's an important one. It's a start. What'll come out of it, I don't know, but it has to be done.
But it's also important what Emily said. I mean, I don't think anybody believes that Donald Trump is going to, by and large, change his rhetoric. Donald Trump is Donald Trump.
Sure.
However, as you said before, he reads polls just like everybody else. And if he decides to start talking about red flag laws or universal background checks, even in the way that Donald Trump does, it does provide cover. And I guess I'm wondering, with that cover, because the Republican Party is pretty squarely behind this president, it seems, do you actually see, whether or not it's in this recess or not, people start to be moved and say, look, if the president's doing it, we feel emboldened to now do this because the Republican Party is going to want to get behind Donald Trump in 2020.
I think it's also a matter of getting some congressional officials to kind of lobby him too. And I think you're seeing that obviously with Lindsey Graham and others. That's got to be there too. There's got to be some kind of lockstep within the party, but also with both institutions, Congress and the White House.
This brings us to 2020, right? Trump may want to pass some kind of, gun-related legislation, however, small, as a hat tip towards voters to show that he does care about this issue of violence. So many Democratic candidates have come out with plans for gun reform legislation this week. Former Vice President Joe Biden has endorsed a national assault weapons buyback program. Cory Booker is rolling out a plan today, I believe. We're seeing candidates support a nationwide gun licensing system, and other candidates are supporting universal background checks. So this is going to be a huge 2020 issue, and I think Republicans see that their response to this issue in this moment is going to be something that comes up again and again on the campaign trail.
Do you have a quick thought on that, Colin? Because I want to break and I want to get to another press issue on this right after the break. But go ahead.
I do want to say one thing about these red flag laws. And so, after Newtown, there were a lot of gun hearings up at the state capitol. And, you'd run into these guys and they have these kind of scary looking parkas with lettering on the back. And they're all these, gun advocates. And they would say to me in the hallways, well, this is a mental health issue. And I would say to them, so I assume when mental health funding is on the table for budget appropriations, you'll be back up here. I mean, you're not just coming up here on gun day, right? Because you're really concerned about funding our mental health system. And they would look at me like I had a mental health problem. What am I talking about? Of course they're not coming back there for that. And the red flag law bothers me a little bit because it's kind of an end case in extremis kind of law, okay? Everything is devolved now. You've got somebody who seems visibly dangerous. We're going to try to get the gun away through a temporary order. What we have is a broken mental health system right now. It needs fix. It's fixing a lot. It needs funding a lot. It needs repair a lot. Not so much because these people are so violent. As I said before, they're not. I mean, if you could get rid of all of it, it wouldn't make that all the violence. It wouldn't make that big a difference. But mental health funding in our country is a real problem, and it's the only time anybody's willing to talk about it is after gun violence, and never in a comprehensive way. And I think that's tragic.
Yeah, and it's a good time to remind people that folks who suffer from mental health issues are far more likely to be the targets of crime themselves than actually the perpetrators of crime, and that the United States does not have higher rates of mental health problems than any other country in the world. we do have much higher rates of gun violence than any other country in the world, and that's something to note. We're talking here with Colin McEnroe, host of The Colin McEnroe Show, Emily Munson, state capitol reporter for Hearst, Connecticut Media, Jonathan Wharton from Southern Connecticut State University. When we come back, we're going to finish up this conversation, including talking about how the press has handled it and how one of the great institutions of the press in the United States, the New York Times, has taken a lot of flack for it. We'll be back with that conversation next in the Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking about the week's news with Dr. Jonathan Wharton. He's Associate Professor of Political Science and Urban Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. And Emily Munson, she's State Capitol Reporter for Hearst, Connecticut Media. If you want to see what our show looks like, you can go to Facebook Live at WNPR Wheelhouse. Joining us as always is Colin McEnroe, the host of The Colin McEnroe Show. Colin, what's on your show today?
Well, at the time that this little boy was separated from his parents, Konstantin Mutu was the youngest child to be separated at the southern border of the United States from his parents. He was 4 months old. He's not from Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras or Mexico. He's actually part of a group known as the Roma or the Romani people. We grew up knowing them as gypsies, a name that they don't particularly, for the most part, like. They are an enormous ethnic minority in Europe, maybe the biggest ethnic minority in Europe. It's hard to know because they tend not to fill out a lot of paperwork. So we're going to talk about that group today. We're going to talk about the Konstantin Mutu case and what happened there, but also tell you a little bit more about who these people really are.
Another interesting topic on the Colin McEnroe Show. I do ask that you listen to that today at 1 o'clock. That should be really interesting. Before we close out our conversation about guns, let's talk about how the press has been covering it. Presidential hopeful Beto O'Rourke has been very vocal. He's been hitting back against Donald Trump, but he's also been asking the question, members of the press, what the bleep? And what he's talking about here, he didn't say bleep, by the way, what he's talking about here largely is the New York Times, their headline after Donald Trump's speech on Monday was Trump urges unity versus racism. And if you heard the speech, that is certainly one way that you could have written a headline. You could have taken that out of the speech. A lot of people looked at that and said, there's many other things about that speech that you could have written about. This was a big backlash for the New York Times, so much so, Colin, they actually changed the headline in a later edition. They had an awful lot of people who read the Times, many of whom are very liberal, saying, I'm going to cancel my subscription. What do you make of the Times, and what do you make of how the press has handled these shootings?
Well, I just want to back up to O'Rourke for a second. It seemed to me at that moment he was more reacting to a lot of questions that he was being asked that he thought the press already knew the answers to. So they were asking if Donald Trump's rhetoric had any role in this, if there's anything the president could do to make things better, blah, 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 blah. And it was a scrum situation, and he kind of exploded at them. He said, WTF, you're asking me questions that you already know the answers to. With the Times, I think a headline needs to accurately characterize a story, and I think whether that headline accurately characterize the story depends a lot on your point of view. If your sympathies lie a little bit more with President Trump, then yes, he actually said something that sounded halfway constructive. If you feel as though this is a disingenuous statement that's followed a long string of verbal forms of abuse and necromancy, then it's not an accurate characterization. I don't think the debate should be about this one particular headline. The debate needs to be, how do we do this really, really tough job? There's Jay Rosen, the press theorist, talks about, he's been talking for a decade now about what he calls toxic objectivity, that ultimately if you try to be objective about things that actually aren't really amenable to that kind of scale balancing, you're doing a huge disservice to the subject. And I don't think we've solved that problem. I think we're talking a little bit more clearly about it right now.
Yeah, Emily, you work in the world of newspapers, and this is something that comes up probably in the newsroom every day. How you view this question of objective truth, knowing what you know about Donald Trump or others, what they've said in the past versus what they're saying right now. How do you look at this as a reporter?
I am frustrated that the conversation right now is focused on one New York Times headline. There's so much more to talk about than this one headline. And this is one national media outlet. They are extremely important and extremely revered. But there are hundreds of members of the press covering these shootings right now. And local media will be staying with this story for months, covering these communities, investigating the shooters, holding legislators accountable for the promises that they make today in 5 or 6 months. So I would really love to not reduce this conversation to one New York Times headline, which they decided to change, because there is so much more reporting, good, solid journalism happening all around this country.
Well, but let me ask you about that, because you bring up the fact, I mean, we work in local media. I work in regional media, and I'm dealing with news outlets across America at public radio stations, and they're all doing that hard work. Do you think in some ways there's a dividing line between the national media and the local media on this issue? Because it's not just the New York Times. I mean, as I walk by the televisions in the newsroom, CNN might be running a crawl at the bottom, talking about one of these shooters, talking about a mystery motive. Well, it's not a mystery motive. He has a manifesto. He's just saying exactly what he's trying to do. At a certain point, the national media seems to have one role in this, the types of questions that they ask a candidate, Beto O'Rourke. And then the local media seems to have another role, which is telling the stories of individuals, people who want to see things done in their communities. It really is a sharp dividing line, but it almost seems like it's getting sharper on issues like this.
Yeah, it's hard to say what is the divide. There's always a yin and yang between the local media and national media. And I think they both have important roles to play here. National media has a lot more resources that they can invest in stories of huge scope, data stories, national politics. But local media deserve credit for rooting out issues in their regions, in their towns that point to huge national issues. So I think both sides just need to give credit where credit is due and work together, hopefully.
Yeah, and I will say, having had to cover the Sandy Hook shootings, it is very much a local issue, and this sort of issue where you have to go to work and the coffee shop and church with the same people that you're covering, and that's a little different than the way the national media often has to do things, Jonathan, when they parachute in. But how do you view all this question of rhetoric, especially coming from the media?
Well, I have to say, especially somebody who teaches political science, and even more so, I actually purposely include right at the beginning of the semester media framing and setting and all that. We have a general discussion about that for almost 2 to 3 weeks. And so many of my students emphasize how sometimes the New York Times is very much an elitist institution as it relates to the newspaper and print industry. And so we're always talking about the words that they use, the framing of how they say it, and what does that mean in context. I think that's important. It's got to be said. This is the New York Times. And as you said, it's the standard, but it's also an elite institution within itself. And so how they frame it, how they say it is very critical, not just for the readers, but writ large for journalists everywhere. And I also want to go back to discussing at least a little bit what you presented, John, about Beto O'Rourke. He's a very over-emotional candidate, and so he has a tendency to really be dramatic, and we certainly saw that there at the microphone and how that went unscripted. So it shouldn't be that surprising that he'll emphasize this. But as somebody who obviously represents that area as a former lawmaker, this had to get at him, and I'm sure it did with the journalist pointing that out.
A quick thought, Emily?
Yeah, quickly. One of the reasons why this headline has been a big deal is because President Trump has made it a big deal, because he's tweeted about it. And he said after 3 years, quote, "I almost got a good headline from the Times." President Trump cares so much about how he's characterized in the media, particularly by the New York Times, who's been critical of his administration.
And even prior for decades.
And prior for decades.
Right,
and prior for
in
decades.
New York.
And he grew up in Queens. There's a great podcast on the Daily that I'll just recommend. It's a conversation between the New York Times publisher, President Trump, and some of their reporters. And it highlights the fact that he craves good coverage from his hometown newspaper. And I think, sometimes we see that playing out in his reaction to the media.
A quick last thought on this, Colin?
These are really, really complicated problems. I mean, one thing the Times took a lot of grief for, I'd say about a year ago, was a profile they did of a white supremacist. And there was a big hue and cry. Why give this guy any attention at all? Why give him what amounts to publicity. I mean, my thought was, no, we need to understand this phenomenon. We need to understand where these people come from, how they get radicalized. But there are a lot of people who are, screaming about that and saying that they were going to cancel their subscriptions, which was also a big thing on Twitter with this headline, I'm going to cancel my subscription. Look, the Times does invaluable work. They have tremendous, terrific reporting staff. Much of what we know of importance about public policy and about Donald Trump, for that matter, comes from the work of the New York Times. But we have a lot of things that we haven't figured out yet. I mean, as a profession, like how do we talk about this politician now who's in the White House who departs so much from all the standards of previous politicians? I don't think we know all the answers yet, but it would be a little bit helpful if the citizenry or the readership or whatever wouldn't suddenly en masse announce, have these tantrums on Twitter. I'm going to cancel my subscription because I didn't like one headline. Well, grow up.
Colin, I saw one tweet that was kind of interesting out there this morning saying that this is almost like a blip on the radar screen. It would be like saying an electric company, I think I'm going to turn off my electricity because I had one brownout for maybe 5 seconds in terms of making a mistake. So I'm not going to subscribe to it anymore.
Well, let's turn to another issue here, something that we've been talking about on the Wheelhouse for quite some time, and that probably, despite all the great press coverage from local media, we might not know any more about than we knew before. So what's happening with casinos in the state? What's happening potentially with the XL Center? The Hartford Courant reported this weekend that the governor has at least given some thought to tying these two objectives together, fixing the XL Center, the aging building where the Whalers used to play, and also trying to bring some casino gambling to the middle part of the state. Interviewed by NBC Connecticut, here's Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin acknowledging that sports betting could be a part of plans to revitalize the XL, but said nothing is close to being a done deal at this point.
The XL Center is obsolete. It's desperately in need of modernization and investment. I think there may well be opportunities, particularly from sports betting, to build some partnerships that help make that renovation possible. But there's a lot more discussion to happen, and I look forward to being part of those conversations.
All right, Emily, almost every week we talk about casinos, where they're going to be, Bridgeport, up north of Hartford, in Hartford. What's this latest twist with the XL? What do we know?
So there's a rumor out there that a casino could be installed at the XL Center. And the source of this rumor is unknown, slightly vague, but this idea was floated at the Capitol by someone. Media is hooked onto it. A number of reporters have been following up on this topic, and the governor's office has told us that there's been no formal discussions about opening a casino at Hartford's XL Center with the arena's owners, which is the Capital Region Development Authority, or the state's two Native American tribes, the Mohegan tribe and the Mashantucket Pequot, who were the supposed buyers of the arena, who might then open a casino at that location. So it seems extremely unlikely that this would happen, but it's an idea that came up at the Capitol, and this is part of a broader conversation about how Connecticut is going to expand gambling in the state. That is an idea that's being strongly pushed by Bridgeport lawmakers and by lawmakers from eastern Connecticut, where the Mohegans and Mashantucket Pequots have their reservations and their casinos, and also lawmakers from north central Connecticut, the East Windsor area, where the two tribes are partnering to build a new casino called Tribal Winds. These lawmakers unveiled a bill last week that they crafted without any input from the governor, and they want to expand the tribe's powers to offer gambling in the state. They'd like to authorize them to open a casino in Bridgeport. They want to give them exclusive rights to offer sports betting here in Connecticut, and also to offer online casino gambling. So that would be huge if that passed. That would really reshape the landscape of betting here in Connecticut and also in New England.
Emily, does it also include this notion of a so-called entertainment zone in Hartford that would somehow or other be based around sports betting but not casino operations?
That's correct. The legislation calls for permitting the tribes to open 4 quote-unquote entertainment zone facilities in the state. And these facilities are venues where sports betting would be permitted in person, and also people would be able to play e-sports, which is basically a version of video games and competition and and betting. And these 4 entertainment zones, one would be located in Bridgeport at the site of a supposed Bridgeport casino. One would be in Hartford. That's specified in the legislation. However, a location is not specified. And then 2 would be located in municipalities yet to be determined. So, I think in that context, the Excel Center kind of comes up again. Could the Excel Center be a site for sports betting in Hartford? We don't know yet.
And what about the cost? I mean, $250 million is what's estimated, right? In the past, they tried to pass legislation related to those expenses, $100 million in the last session. With the General Assembly, but where's that going? Is that even?
Well, no. This time they would want private investors to fix
do
up
this.
the Excel Center.
Yeah,
that's a big part of it.
And how viable is that really for investors in the first place?
So the CRDA has revised down their demands for how much money they need in terms of investment. They most recently were asking for something in the ballpark of $100 million, but they still couldn't get lawmakers to support that. And Governor Ned Lamont did not put that money in his capital budget. The Excel Center is aging; it needs a lot of renovations, and that's having people think about what is the next phase for this arena. But yeah, it's a big price tag, and who's going to pay for it is a question.
Bring back the Whalers.
Well, so I'm just trying to follow all the things because Emily laid it out very well, Colin. But I mean, of the moving parts, and I won't remember all of them. But so you've got 2 tribes that are being worked with by the state in a way that we're not entirely sure is completely legal. MGM has big problems with it. MGM would like to expand in Connecticut. They're probably not going to be able to expand. They've built a casino in Springfield that's not doing as well as maybe it could. If you bring a casino to downtown Hartford, maybe it could look like that Springfield casino, but is that actually what Hartford needs? We need to renovate the Excel Center. Is there a Bridgeport casino on the table? Is there more gambling in Eastern Connecticut? I mean, look, we're doing this again, but now it's getting even more complicated. How could we possibly make any informed decisions about the best way to deal with any of these things with all of these moving parts?
Well, I don't think that we can, actually. But I would just add to that Governor Lamont, it seems to be that the thing that I think his policy is basically no money, no lawsuits. I mean, the state can't throw any money at any problems because he doesn't want to borrow any money to do it. And he's really worried about litigation. I don't see any of these plans. Emily knows more about this than me, so maybe she actually knows what they've said about it. It seems to me that any plan that expands tribal gaming in Connecticut and tribal gaming rights is going to occasion a lawsuit from MGM. I can't imagine that they won't sue about this. It's also not an iron – I mean, one of the cases that the tribes make is that sports betting is a casino game. So if, in fact, they have – a monopoly on casino games in Connecticut, they have a monopoly on sports betting. If that could wind up in court too, not just from MGM, but from some other potential sports betting operator. And I'm not sure how that case would go. So unless these lawsuits can be thrown out quickly based on standing or ripeness, I'm not sure exactly how much standing MGM has to sue over something like this. But otherwise, I don't think that Governor Lamont can avoid a lawsuit if there are going to be bills that expand gaming operations for the tribes in a way that MGM deems offensive and to their detriment.
So Jonathan, what do we make of all of this?
Well, as somebody who studies economic development, especially in cities, I'm mystified by this as it relates to tourism and entertainment development. I agree with Emily in the idea that CRDA, which is the capital redevelopment agency that deals with a lot of this in the capital area, should really do another report and say what's the feasibility of something like this? Is it really possible to get something off the ground like this? I'm more concerned long term in terms of its sustainability. We already know in the region gambling does not solve everything economically, and politically it's very messy, and legally we already know the trouble it brings. So I don't think it's going to be a slam dunk for any city, whether it's Bridgeport or whether it's Hartford. And we already see the problems and the mess ups here in Hartford, for example, with what happened with the soccer stadium right now, what happened even with the baseball stadium. That came in way overpriced. So I'd like to know what is going to take place for the future for a city like Hartford. And that's still not going to solve our bigger problems in an urban area in Connecticut.
Well, what's interesting too, Emily, is you talk about these potential of entertainment zones that could include increased playing of esports, something that has gotten really big around the country.
Yes.
There are college teams where kids are playing electronic sports now. Just a note here that because the president made mention of video gaming as potentially one of the biggest problems that are involved in mass shootings, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of truth to that claim, but
None.
it is something that the president has said. Stocks of several video gaming companies have dropped in the course of the last couple of days. So that's just one more complication. What do we think is going to happen next with all this? Because again, we've been talking about some version of casino expansion here for quite some time. What happens next with the legislature, do you think?
So very practically, this bill has been shared with legislative leaders and the governor, who were not part of its creation, and it's definitely going to undergo some revisions. The Senator Kathy Austin, who is one of the biggest proponents of the bill and a key architect of this legislation, has admitted that she expects some portions to change, including perhaps the idea that the tribes would be the exclusive purveyors of sports betting in the state, because she acknowledges that off-track betting locations in the state have strongly pushed for the right to offer sports betting. Sportech has indirectly threatened to bring a lawsuit if they're not included in this. So there's pieces to work out, and those constituents do have supporters in the legislature who would support changes to this. So I expect revisions to the legislation. We'll see if there's a call for a special session, which is what these legislators want. It's hard to say at this point.
Emily Munson, State Capitol reporter for Hearst, Connecticut Media. Jonathan Warden's here from SCSU, and Colin McEnroe is the host of the Colin McEnroe Show. When we come back, we'll hear a few of our feats of strength for this week, maybe a few grumbles as well in the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We like to end our show with some feats of strength or maybe a few grievances, and we'll start with Jonathan Warden. Jonathan, what's on your mind this week?
Well, feats of strength. Somehow I got here. I had a flat tire on my bicycle ride on the way to the train for the Hartford line from New Haven. So God bless Scott for picking me up, your producer. Great guy, obviously. But I tried my best, and I just made the train in time. I guess my biggest gripe, though, is I wish one day Connecticut Transit will get their act together and time it right with the trains so we can actually, connect up better timing-wise.
Oh, so you
to buses.
Yeah, because the bus doesn't start up that early, and they don't run enough train lines to Hartford. They only run one an hour.
We've heard this from our intrepid producer, Carmen Baskoff, our transit expert, who has the same problem. If you get here on the train but you miss the bus, it's a big problem getting that last mile. So,
it does.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you got a ride today, and glad you made it up here.
Absolutely.
Emily, how about you? What's in your mind?
So I have a grievance. I'd like to point out a recent news story that I just can't stop thinking about. And a recent round of hospital inspection reports by the State Department of Public Health found that several hospital errors caused the deaths of people here in the state. And in addition, there were multiple instances when objects were left in patients following surgery. I don't know if anyone has listened to the podcast Dr. Death. If you haven't, please immediately go download it and listen to it. If you've listened to that podcast, you'll know why this report gives me such chills.
Yeah, and maybe we'll find a link and tweet it out or something. We'll make sure that people can see this report. Yeah, thank you for sharing a really scary grievance. How about you, Colin?
We were talking about how innovation often comes in the states and the cities, so I'm going to do a feat of strength to America's second most famous gay mayor. He's the mayor of West Sacramento. His name is Christopher Cabaldon. I hope I'm saying his last name correctly. He's a great innovator. It's a small city. It's got a lot of problems. He has taken that as a way of giving himself permission to try a lot of things without running it through study groups and boards and commissions, whether it's new bike share programs, urban farming, an app to track homeless encampments, He's just ready to try almost anything. There's a great piece about him in Governing Magazine. It's called "Just Do It," and he actually introduced Mayor Pete when Mayor Pete announced his candidacy too.
And thank you for that. I got a feat of strength here. A lot of people talk about why they should leave Connecticut, what Connecticut doesn't have going for it. I like to celebrate our arts community when at all possible. And this past weekend in my little corner of the state in Litchfield County, I attended a pretty remarkable event called the Five Senses Festival. It's a production by the Palobolas Dance Company, which is based in Washington. It took place in a beautiful wooded private property. It combined dance and music and food and yoga and ideas conversations. And Colin, it's something that you talk about an awful lot. It was the sort of festival where different artists came together and learned from each other and improvised and did something that could only have happened at this particular festival. I hope it's something that grows, and I really hope it's something that is replicated across the state, because more of that shows off some of the really incredible talent that we have, interdisciplinary talent in our state. Colin McEnroe is the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks to Emily Munson. She's state capitol reporter for Hearst, Connecticut Media. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Thanks to Dr. Jonathan Wharton, Associate Professor of Political Science and Urban Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who listens to The Wheelhouse. Thanks to Kion Wolf, Katie Tolarski, and Scott Breedy.